In this recording, I will be talking about how to write a scientific paper, and I will be focusing on the results and discussion sections, the conclusion, and I will also be mentioning briefly the reference list and appendix. The results section is where you present to your readers your results, and they can be in the form of graphs or tables or a combination of both. The key decision to either include a graph or a table is how is better to present the information, what will make it clearer to your readers, what the points you are trying to make are. In general, avoid presenting the same data as a graph and a table just for the sake of it. If they are literally if you're presenting the same, exactly the same type of information, and the only thing you can say is that this table shows this can be better seen as a graph, then question yourself why including the table in the first place if you can see the information better as a graph. So unless it's going to add something new, do not present the same data into formats. This section needs to contain results and not only raw data. For example, if you're performing a titration, milliliters of the chemical will be the raw data, but the concentration of the unknown chemical is actually the result. If you are measuring the partition coefficient of salicylic acid, the weight of salicylic acid in the dichloromethane section is the raw data, but the actual result of the experiment will be the partition coefficient of salicylic acid in dichloromethane. If you're using a flame photometer to measure potassium and sodium ions, in bottled water, the actual results will be what are the concentration of potassium and sodium ions in that particular bottle of water. So make sure that you don't only provide raw data, but you actually give the results that your readers are expecting. Presentation is very important, so make sure that the graphs, the figures and the tables are well presented, that the axes contain labels, that tables and figures are numbered and have a meaningful caption. All that is important. You don't want your tables and figures look like a draft just directly produced from Excel. You want them to have a perfect presentation, like what you would find in a published paper or in a book. Never start the results section by just putting in a table or a graph. Always provide some introductory paragraph that sets your readers' minds on what are you going to present. If you cannot think of anything else to say, at the very least, just start this section saying results for the experiments are shown in tables X and Y and figure Z. This is a good place in the results to include descriptive information. Figure S shows how Y increases with increasing Z, or doubles with the increasing Z. So that's sort of description of what the graph says, what the table shows. You can include calculations here if whatever experiment you are presenting does have calculations, or put them in the appendix. It's a fine line on whether taking the decision of whether they would be better in the appendix or they are better here. In my case, I normally take the decision depending on how long they are. So if they are short, if they are going to occupy half a page, maximum a page, I would probably include them in the results section. Anything longer, I would suggest putting it in the appendix and then give a summary of final results, of summary of data in a table. Or you can give a sample calculation here, for example, for one of the chemicals, and just say all the other calculations are included in the appendix. If you put calculations here, make sure that they're well presented and they're in a compact form. It looks But if your readers look at a page which is almost empty except one little column on the left, which it just gives an impression of there's nothing there. So make sure that the page looks suitably full, that there are no lots of empty blank space, and that your reader doesn't have to scroll down page after page just to go through that section and move on to the next section. Discussion. The discussion is where you explain to your readers what the results actually mean, and where you put your work in context with what other researchers are doing in that field. And that is why you need in-text citations, and that's why always a discussion must contain in-text citations. If you find yourself writing a discussion and you find there's no need for you to quote anything, then rethink your discussion because you are not going down the right path. Think of the results section as the place in which you put your results forward to your reader and you explain what the results are. And the discussion, you explain them what those results actually mean. So what does it mean that that value has increased or decreased? How does it fit? How do your values, your findings fit with what other researchers have found? It's difficult to write discussion. It is very difficult, and please, I'm always happy to give you feedback on what your discussion might contain, and it will depend on the results you are presenting. So it needs to be an individual discussion between you and me in what your results mean. And that's why I would really encourage you to organize a tutorial with me if you need any guidance. And it might be that the tutorial is, Emilia, I have no idea what to discuss. And that is fine. You don't have to organize a tutorial having an idea what the results mean. It means that it may be that they actually don't mean anything to you and you need help with that. So keep that in mind. Some journals will allow you to join results and discussion under one heading, and I particularly don't mind. Typically, if you find yourself describing the results and also discussing what those values, what those results mean, you might be better off joining those two sections and having a section called results and discussion. So, and you talk about, here's some pH results, and this is how they compare with pH results in other areas that also have marshes. These are some phosphate results, and this is how they compare with typical phosphate levels for a water body of this type. It is difficult, it's very personal, and it depends to a certain extent on your writing style. So I'm happy to have those conversations if you need further input. The conclusion is typically a paragraph or two in which you remind your readers of the aim of the research. You remind your readers of what the key findings of your research have been, and the key message of what those findings mean. Basically, it's a summary of key points made in the paper. It's a bit like, if you can't be bothered to read the whole paper, read this. This is the key message. Walk out of this paper with this in mind. Sometimes conclusions, you might find it appropriate in your paper. It provides suggestions for future research or other techniques that can be used to measure those same parameters. In a typical paper, at least in chemistry, conclusions do not include references. And that is because you are not introducing any new information. You are simply summarizing to your reader the key points that you have already made, especially in the discussion. So that might be different if, for example, the paper you're writing doesn't have a discussion section. But if it does have one, I'm not rejecting that idea. But in general, if your paper already contains a discussion, is not very good form to include references in the conclusion, because a reference would be, oh, this is a new piece of information I'm giving you, and here's the reference. And if it was that important, then your readers might think, hey, why didn't you tell me all this in the discussion? Why are you coming out with this right at the end of the paper? And that is typically what happens in chemistry papers. The reference list in a typical journal, you would follow whichever system the journal tells you to follow. At Christchurch, unless you're told otherwise, you follow the Harvard format. And it's important you follow it well, because an untidy reference list can really make you, well, it can make you lose marks. And also, it really gives a very poor impression, like you couldn't be bothered to format it correctly. So make sure it is consistently formatted, that is in alphabetical order. It's not a number list. Harvard references are not number. All those things are important. It's towards the end of your paper, and it can really create a poor impression to your reader. And you don't want your readers to think, oh, they couldn't be bothered to format the reference list. So that sort of things add to the strength of your paper. It makes your readers more keen on listening to your points and following them. Finally, the appendix, you may or may not have one, is typically called supplemental material, supplemental information in journals. If you include an appendix, make sure that it's meaningful. Mention it in the main body of the article. Calculations are given in the appendix, or table X, which contains this additional data, is given in the appendix. Do not add it for the sake of it. Only add it if at some point throughout your results or discussion section you feel that that piece of information is not fundamental, but it's important enough that you would like them to, you might be interested on these in the raw data. You might be interested in some additional detail, and you can put in the appendix. If at some point you find yourself, especially in discussion, talking a lot about something that is in the appendix, for example, a particular figure or a particular table, consider whether it wouldn't be better to put that information in the results section, for example. An appendix is an additional source of information, typically for calculations and raw data. It's not the place to put a figure or a table which is fundamental to what you're discussing. And that's it. Please ask me any doubts or questions you might have about writing scientific papers. I'm always keen on listening to your, reading your drafts and providing feedback on them. So please please email me to organize a tutorial. And if you really don't know how to get started, again, please contact me and organize a tutorial, because I can help you make up your mind on how to write your results, how to write your discussion, how to cover your, what to include in your introduction. So this is all, and thank you very much for listening. I hope this was helpful.